Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sacred Anarchies, a post-church podcast. As always, I am here with my colleague and co-creator and best friend, Barry Taylor. But we have a
Hello.
very special guest with us today, Josh de Keijzer. Hi, Josh. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to hang out with some of the coolest people on the planet. And I mean it, even though I'm saying this for the second time now.
Yes, you said it before we started recording, so I appreciate you giving us a plug again. Very generous, a very generous accolade. But speaking of accolades, Josh, you are seriously one of the coolest people that we know, and certainly that I know. And I remember, and it's been kind of a walk down memory lane for me the past couple weeks. I had a really good girlfriend on last week. We went to Bible college together. She's now a psychotherapist working in religious trauma. So we had a ball. You could just imagine, from 20 years ago, Assembly of God Bible College, to now, and the fields we work in. And now you, who I met in my early days at seminary, an evangelical seminary that was progressive evangelical at the time, maybe not so much now, but I have this vision of you sitting in the library behind a desk. I think you were working at the library at the time. And for me, you had this cool European Dutch accent, and you were kind of this really cool guy who had some cool thoughts and academic aspirations. And you called me Francesca, which I love because it's my middle name. And I've always wanted my name reversed, Francesca Maria. And so I was just so endeared to you from the beginning. And we've just kind of kept in touch through the years. So I don't know, what do we want to say? Is that like 13, 14, 15 years, something crazy like that?
Yeah, it must be, I would say 12 years, something
Yeah.
like that.
And now you are a theologian here in Europe, in Holland, and you do a few different things. You consider yourself post-academic, you're a writer, you're within the publishing industry, but you also have this amazing blog and Instagram called After God's End, which focuses a lot on radical theology, a little bit deconstruction, a little bit post-theist, but also one of your big things is the market as God, or God as market, which we'll talk a little bit about this podcast today. But why don't you kind of start out? I've said what I think about you and what I think about what you do. But why don't you take a moment and kind of introduce yourself to our listeners and give us a little blurb of what you're all about?
Yeah, so I remember sitting in a classroom of our German professors at the time. And he had some of his PhD and his, what is it? What is that degree called? Master of Theology,
Oh yeah, MTA. Sure.
theological master degree. And so there dropped in this cool girl with a black hat, and that was Francesca. And I remember thinking, like, my goodness, like, look at these young people, so cool, so like in the zone. And will I ever be able to, reach that level of academic expertise? I was in awe. And I was, of course, in my first year or my second year of my master. So that's my first memory of you.
Hmm,
Um,
good
okay,
memory.
so I went to this. I'm from the Netherlands, and I went to America in 2009 to study evangelical theology to become an apologist of the Christian faith. And so, to my disappointment, the person heading the apologetics department had moved to another position, and so there was no apologetics going on really. Initially disappointed, but then the deconstruction started, and I realized it was a big gift that I was being taken for a ride into the unknown. Um, and I think it was a combination of personal hardship. There was some traumatic experience going on in my first year of
Hmm.
seminary. Um, Combined then with the intellectual journey, combined also with me starting to see racism for what it is in the United States,
Hmm.
and my implication as a white Westerner in that process. And it also became, and my religion, the
Mhm.
implication of my religion, that and a sort of unstoppable process started. And I just had to follow the rabbit down the hole, but I was also very hesitant. during my master's study, many friends said, go on, do a PhD. And so I decided to apply for the PhD program, the one in Minneapolis that is there, one theological PhD program at Luther Seminary.
Yeah.
And I promised myself that to stay on the safe side, I was going to do Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And in order to study Dietrich Bonhoeffer well, I had to go back to Luther. And so there was no deconstruction together with the French philosophers or continental philosophy, none of the sort. But I heard a lot about it. A lot of my friends were really into that stuff, and Pete Rollins, but I just heard about it. I didn't really dig into it. But it was studying Luther that I realized how much of Christianity before Luther, but definitely also after Luther, and then we're talking about Calvinism and a Protestant tradition, were what I consider con jobs. Like it was a domestication of whatever it is that comes to us through the person of Jesus Christ in a horrible way.
Yeah.
And so I deconstructed, but in a sort of a safe way where I kept in touch with what I consider to be the core of my Christian faith. But that deconstruction, once I realized that that proper theology is not a bounded set and is not a matter of erecting boundaries between us and them, in and out and all that stuff, but it was more like a centered thing where Jesus Christ is a center of orientation with different perspectives and different interpretations. And once I realized that sort of to get at the truth, whether it's the truth of Revelation or the truth of whatever you want, that a paradoxical approach or an antithetical or dialectical approach is helping us to get much closer to the truth, but always never get at it. And that any claim to get at the truth is at the same time missing it. So once I got that, I was able to get into conversation with my continental philosophical buddies over at Luther Seminary. And one person in particular who was Chester O'Gorman is his name. And he was an atheist, but he studied theology and he was going for his PhD, and he studied Bultmann and Zizek, and his thing is that Black Lives Matter and the LGBT movement, they are the revelation of Jesus Christ in the world today. They are the location of of the disruption. So I had very wonderful conversations with him. And I guess through those conversations and, with the help of some other elements and some other people, I became much more open to the idea of atheism and more conversant with it and more positive toward it, which is what makes me what I am now, a radical theologian, I suppose.
Yeah, but you're not an atheist. You wouldn't check you're an atheist when it comes to a certain type of God, evangelical God and interventionist God. You'd say you're an atheist to that God, which I think a lot of us would, who are in the radical theology camp. But you wouldn't say.
And I would say that I'm also a methodological. That's the first time I'm saying this, but I might be a methodological atheist, by which I mean that there may be God, or there may be an ultimate reality that actually calls us. I very much like Caputo in that sense. There is a call. But methodologically, God is completely erased from that picture. So we may hear a call. There is a claim upon our lives. There is a moral obligation, if you will, or a moral incitement to get going and to construct a better world. But methodologically, any attempt that you make to kneel down God is a domestication of God, and therefore a loss of God and the exaltation of the human subject.
An attempt to contain that which cannot be contained, and an attempt to know that which cannot be known, essentially. Yeah. Well, so you've talked, so I want to talk about a few things, and Barry, feel free to kind of butt in at any point here. You have this incredible Instagram that and I follow a lot of kind of theologians and people who are deconstructing and have come out of evangelicalism. And I just kind of follow them to sort of keep my fingers on the pulse of like this big conversation that's happening at the moment. You are probably the only account, one of the only, if not the only, that I'm like, oh, so good. Okay, I'm reposting this. This is you're so prolific, and you have these mic dropping one-liners that are so good. And I post my own stuff and my own content on Instagram as well, but I post bigger quotes because I'm like, oh, this one sentence isn't going to do it. You really need like 2 or 3. You have a way of communicating something really powerful, and that just has such a big bang, in just one sentence. It's like, and so it's like, where is that well? Where does it come from? Where do you get this inspiration? Who are you reading? What's your journey been like? I mean, I know these are so many questions. And when we spoke briefly last week, you said you're really kind of living in the realm now of post God's death. God isn't really dead. God has just been transferred to the market now and can be seen made manifest in capitalism and consumer capitalism, digital capitalism, and things like that. So I don't know, maybe you can speak to a little bit of some of what I just said. And Barry, do you want to jump in here?
Well, no, I'd like to hear.
You'd like to hear it expand why.
I'd like to hear Josh explain all of those things that you just brought up. So
there you go.
Well, after
Josh,
that,
you have to have the mic.
I'll just fire away. I have a tendency to sort of get blackouts, so then I forget where I'm at or what we were going for.
Yeah,
so
that never happens to us.
So
that never happens to us.
You were asking me, what are you reading? I am not reading anything. I'm not reading. I'm not able to read. I try to join the book group or the book club, Barry's book club. On this book of Caputo, and I'm also supposed to do a book review for an evangelical journal on a book by Caputo, but it's not going to happen because I'm super busy. When I came back from the States back to Holland, it was very hard financially, and it's still very hard financially because theologians are no longer needed.
Yeah.
And of course, my old evangelical network, can only shun me because I'm either lost or going to hell, or I just don't exist anymore.
Do they shun you, Josh? Is that true?
I think to an extent, yeah. I can give you one example without naming names, but I remember one professor at Bethel, for instance, whom I would still bump into in the library at Bethel Seminary many times. He had only had one question for me every time I saw him. He would say, "How was your daughter?" And I'm like, "Fine." So now we get the next question: "How are your Bonhoeffer studies going?" Nothing ever. For me, that's the clearest example. Something is a little off. And so I'm not in touch with even the evangelical world much anymore. So I wasn't able to find employment as a theologian in the Netherlands, and had to look for something else. And so my latest gig is a freelance work, or freelancing as a copywriter. And I've started, and as a freelancer, I bumped into a content creator, and we said, why don't we work together? So we're setting up a business now, a content marketing business. So I'm doing the very thing that I sort of hate, that's like market companies. And so I consider myself post-academic. The last piece that I'm working on is an essay for a book in honor of Gary Simpson, my Dr. Father, my dissertation advisor. And of course, I can't say no to that request.
Sure.
And I'm honored to be able to contribute to that. But I was thinking, what can I do? Do I have to do more research? Do I have to read another 10 books? I mean, who's going to pay me for reading another 10 books? Who's going to help me find the time to do it? Nobody. So I wrote to the editors and said, look, I will do it, but it will have to be a post-academic essay. And then the post-academic nature of my work is very much also the message that I have. And that is that we need a new type of Christianity that is beyond academia, and that finds its way back in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big challenge. I mean, that's always been the challenge for radical theology. I mean, it got lost in the conversation, because the first wave just lived only in the academy and in a very small part of the academy. I think there's possibility these days because there are people trying to do kind of new theological work outside of academy and institution, but it's always the challenge is moving past the academic stronghold and finding your way to a different kind of conversation. I think.
But you still have a claim, and you still value, obviously, theological engagement, because you have this blog After God's End, and you do make these powerful statements about religion and God and the trajectory of all of it. So why?
Yeah, so that's true. I still have an opinion. I'm still very passionate about theological claims, and especially about, kicking the legs from under them. That's a deep, pleasurable thing to do. And where does it come from? I guess it comes from the fact that at heart I am a theologian. I've never lost my passion, and there's one source, and that is like deep anger and frustration, anger with the Christian God, which often spills over in anger to the real God, if there is such a thing. So this is like divine providence. Don't make me laugh. Don't make me laugh. So yeah. I think I've gone through a lot of hardship in my life, which we don't need to get into details about, but a lot of hardship. And so I can't handle the evangelical God anymore. I cannot handle the Calvinistic God. Mm-hmm. Those are idols. Yeah. And those are idiotic constructs that just don't hold up to reality. Yeah. And so I find inspiration there. And then the other thing is that I believe that God is not dead. And when I say God's not dead, I don't mean the movie.
Right.
But
thank you.
I mean,
good.
Oh.
Right. I mean, it's not the claim of an apologist, but it's the claim of an analysis of the world as we see it. And I often feel that we can only explain the dynamics of our world looking at the poverty, looking at the economic systems, looking at the widespread injustice, and looking at the blindness of the West for its complicity in justice and its role as instigator of justice in the world. And that we cannot understand these things unless we open up the debate again for the theological dimension or the religious dimension of it all. Yes, we are post-religion in Europe and in the West or Europe, I don't know. We're post-religion. We're never, ever going to be post-religious. And by closing the gap, by fooling ourselves as Westerners that we have left religion behind and therefore also the religious behind, we have fallen or are falling into a trap of our own making, because it's the ultimate delusion. We still have idols and we still go for them and we still bow down for them.
Yeah.
And we make human sacrifices left and right.
Indeed, we do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting conversation is, and I've had this. I mean, some of the things that you said remind me a little bit of my friend Castor Bruin, who talks a lot about the minute one God dies, we resurrect a whole bunch of other gods elsewhere, and we're always living with the twilight of the gods. We just don't use that. We don't always use that term to describe it, but that kind of human tendency is just there to venerate certain things and have them function in our lives as a big other in one way or another.
Yeah, and so they go very deep. They are the deep structures that are invisible to our own eyes. Yeah. So, for instance, for my studies into Bonhoeffer, I needed to go into Luther, and going into Luther, I had to delve into medieval theology a little bit. Yeah. I won't say too much, but enough to get it. And so what you see happening is that that the medieval theologians, the scholastics, they cannot see the world any other than a reality emanating from a big origin.
Yeah.
It's a causal connection. So it's a causal connection on the one hand, it's an emanation of reality, and it's then a circular going back into the Godhead. And so they cannot think any other way. And God is then the linchpin of society. Now, Luther definitely breaks that down. He just breaks it, and he splits God into the hidden God and the revealed God. The hidden God, let's not talk about it. The revealed God, that's a baby with a dirty diaper in a manger.
Yeah.
So he flips the script. And of course, right after Luther, even during Luther's own lifetime, that already changes. And you see with Calvinism that the sovereign God, the Almighty One, the origin, the causal origin of the chain of being is erected again. It gets different names, but it's a similar thing. So the sovereign Lord who governs the whole earth, and Calvin thinks he is doing that with the help of a perspicuous scripture, but basically he is reverting to the scholastic categories of thought again.
Yeah.
So it doesn't disappear from our Western society. And then when Christianity breaks down, I find super interesting that somehow in our Western mindset, we need to have another linchpin to hang everything on. We need to have another foundation that is necessary for the whole thing to operate. So Thomas Aquinas talks about God as the necessary being. Why? Well, if you have a cause, you go back to the cause of the cause, to the cause of the cause. And at the very beginning, you have the first cause. And so God is the necessary being upon which all contingent beings rest, so to speak. But what do we do in our Western society? The same thing. Open your mouth against the free market system. That is not possible, because that is the necessary being of our Western society. And that is the God that needs to be preached to all societies. And so we think we're preaching democracy, but we're not, because the economy is not democratic at all. It's about survival of the fittest. And that is what we preach. But we've located another necessary object, an idol, a taboo that cannot be touched.
Yeah.
And so I think that is what we've done in our Western culture. We've never abandoned the gods. We've given them different names.
That's really interesting and insightful. I want to ask you a question a little bit about that, and also kind of go back to what you said about Black Lives Matter and the LGBT movements as representing Jesus as the way that Jesus is now breaking into the world and as disruption. So there's been a lot going on this week in the world. I feel like you could say that about any week, but particularly with the LGBTQ community this week. Pope Francis came out with the decree in terms of not being affirming and not approving same-sex marriage. I won't go into it. I'm pretty sure everybody knows why he did that, and he made that very explicit, and it's this huge uproar. The EU just recently made a statement about all of Europe will be an LGBTQ free zone, and they use that wording to kind of fly in the face of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and law and policies in Poland. And so, this is kind of all in the news this week. And as we're talking about God as market, or, free market capitalism society, all the rest of it, I'm sure you've read The Market as God by Harvey Cox. Yeah?
No, I haven't. No.
Nope.
So this is, I've read about it. I've read analyses and reviews of it.
Okay,
so I know what it says.
That's good enough.
Yeah, but this is part of the post-academic plight. Just like, nope, I don't have time to read Harvey Cox. It's awful.
No, that's okay. But you know what? Honestly, I find that if you read the reviews and the analyses, it's just as good as reading the book most of the time. But even just reading like the first page or two, which is what I've done. he dedicates the book, one, to Pope Francis, and this is written in the last few years, so it's relatively new. I think it's maybe 2016, 2018 copyright, something like that. And the very first page quotes Pope Francis and what he had to say in terms of the market. And he says, to quote Francis, "We have created new idols. The worship of the ancient golden calf has returned. In the idolatry of money in the system, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interest of a deified market." So sounds pretty good, Francis. Thanks for making this comment. For the most part, we agree and we think it's intriguing. And then Cox goes on to talk about how Francis basically says that, for those who say capitalism is acting in this very manifest destiny, Pax Romana sort of way, it's going to bring justice, it's going to bring cohesiveness, it's going to bring opportunity and equality. Francis says, actually, this is an opinion and expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized working of the prevailing economic system, because those who are excluded, who this is supposed to help, are still waiting, essentially. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on Francis being able to say something like this and make a declaration and really kind of make a pronouncement on capitalism and the free market. Is it possible to critique systems of injustice like he has done here, like capitalism and the free market, and still make such a decree against a community like the LGBT? I mean, what do we do with that? What do we do with these religious leaders who would agree with you when you're talking about God and free market, but then make a massive, statement like he did this week? I don't know. What are your thoughts on some of this?
Well, that's a great question. I think on the one hand, we need to see Pope Francis as playing a very, or walking on a very thin line.
Yeah.
Within his own even Roman Catholic Church. And he's probably already going as far as he can. And there are forces within the Catholic Church that would completely remove him if they could. So that may have to do something with the dynamics. One other thought that comes to me is that if I look at my evangelical theology, there is always a strong separation between sexual ethics on one hand, and economic ethics, public ethics on the other. And the Roman Catholic Church has a long-standing tradition of social ethics that are pretty good. The social ethics teachings of the church are rather strong, and they kind of have I won't say socialist, of course, but a pretty good social ethics. Yeah. So that on the one hand, and so maybe in the Roman Catholic theology, there is a similar dichotomy between sexual ethics and public or economic ethics, but I don't know for sure. I don't know the Catholic Church that well, but I do see that in evangelical theology, you can easily have that. Of course, not very much so in American evangelicalism, but there are plenty of evangelicals who will be very socially engaged. I'm thinking of Ron Sider, for instance. He's a great example. Because he does the same thing. He's not GLBT affirming, but at the same time, listen to him when it comes to new radical economic ideas. Yeah. He can teach you, so he can teach us something, but then yet he has this sort of conservative stance on sexual ethics. If I look at myself, my journey was not easy to journey to a point where I was LGBT affirming. So my evangelical theology was deeply entrenched, and the prejudices were deeply entrenched. And I'm very grateful. And I don't deserve any compliment here. I'm very grateful for Luther Seminary and for basically being forced to dwell and live with brothers and sisters who were gay. And they taught me so much. And their patience and their love and their sincerity and their example did so much to me. That's what did it for me.
I think there are a couple of factors I think worth sort of weighing up. The first is, Francis is from Argentina. Yeah. Which, like much of South America, has been on the receiving end of the hardships caused by capitalism.
Yeah.
It also exposed, I don't think he necessarily embraced it, but exposed to liberation theologies, which began, essentially in the global South countries, particularly Brazil and stuff like that. So I think there's an unsurprising understanding of capitalism that comes from somebody who comes from a world that's marked as much by poverty and disparities of wealth, as opposed to the illusion. There wasn't much of a middle class for very long in many Latin American countries. You were either rich or poor, and so those disparities were inscribed in there. And when it comes to the LGBTQ issues, I think well, two things. I mean, he signed off on that document, but he didn't write the document. It's a church document.
Sure.
And this is not a defense of it, by the way, because I think this is the problem with when you're the titular head of a massive institution, regardless of your personal opinion. It means, to some degree, it means nothing. It means everything, but it also means nothing. And I think from his perspective, he has one of those very conflicted views, because he's appears to be a very warm and generous human being who wants to make room for as many people as he possibly can within the framework of a Catholic kind of theology. And so his support of LGBTQ people was based on his notion of including people. What has never been front and center with him is any shift in his view on the idea that anything other than male, female, heteronormative sexual activity and the possibility of procreation, which is a factor in Catholic sexuality.
Yeah.
That's always, I mean, he said that it was a disordered, that homosexuals were disordered, even as he's saying, but they need to be included in the church. So it's no surprise that, and I think we're all quite capable of contradictory and conflicting moral positions and ethical positions on things. But the folly is, at the heart of Catholic sexuality is that and still, I mean, this is why they're against abortion and against contraception, because marriage is for procreation. And I think, as I said to you yesterday, that creates a bit of a problem if you're infertile.
Yeah,
I wonder if you're
or you don't want children.
Yeah, but if you're, let's just say that you are infertile and incapable of having children, technically, if you go in the linearity of those kind of arguments, then they shouldn't let that person get married because they can't procreate.
Right.
But of course, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the anomalies in our systems.
Well, those who get married later in life, maybe in their 60s. So, you can go across the board and just kind of question them. And it's like, well, what's the next answer? What would you say about these things? Yeah. Anyway, it gets us a little off topic, but I was just really interested, Josh, in, how you reconcile, people who have these critiques of capitalism on one hand, but still seem to have a really conservative theology, because, this is, Barry and I talk about this on and off all the time. This is part of the issue with the Protestant liberal mainline churches in North America, is that they have these really liberal social stances, and their, activism and their politics, it's all quite left and progressive, but they're still working within a fairly traditional and tired, my commentary, theistic framework of God. And so it just, like you're doing great work in the world, but you actually don't have to do it in the name of God. You can be just a secular humanist and, not plug God in there, because what you have to say about God is just totally unhelpful and boring.
Boring. Yeah, but I think Barry really said a few very interesting things about Pope Francis and the context of where he is saying those things.
Mhm.
Very insightful. Yeah, you don't need Christianity to be a good moral person, but that is the problem with mainline Christianity in North America and even in Europe, I think. The conservatives, they have doubled down on a untenable worldview, and then the ones that have opened themselves for the world have basically morphed into the world, just with a sort of a religious mask around it, but it means
Mm.
nothing.
See, there you go with
Both
those like
conservatives and
one-liners.
mainliners are irrelevant. What's that? Sorry.
I know. I said there you go with those one-liners. They're really, poignant and powerful. It's really
Well,
a mouthful.
but I was thinking about that, because I like Josh's posts. I like the visual
Yeah.
element, the way you've put them together. But what I noticed was, and it plays into this whole thing, because I used to teach copywriting, and the art of copywriting is to break it down so that you can say in one sentence everything that you need to say. And in that regard, I think it's fairly evident that I read those things and I go, oh, a copywriter wrote this. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I mean that in a like
Someone who knows how to write wrote this.
someone that can write good copy can say a world in a sentence. I mean, I think that's really, it's like a good novelist. One sentence is sometimes all you need to get the whole picture.
But Barry, I've actually been learning from you, because I follow you on Instagram. So I'm like, damn, how does he do it? That's like so insightful.
Yeah,
and your
situationist
Jesus series, man, I kept laughing. They're just so good. And each time I would go through the entire cartoon, I had to read the entire thing just to situate the quote there. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Well, that's a mutual admiration society. I just like, the thing I think that there's a certain interesting impact between words and images. I've always been drawn to that. I like artists that use words in their work. I really love like Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer, who do these kind of very word-based text works. Lawrence Weiner. I've always been fascinated by the potency of that, and I think it's a great, in this kind of strange netherworld of digital religion that I think we're all increasingly living in. I think there's something very interesting that's not probably explored enough within the realm of the relationship between text and image, and what that does to perception, the way we see it and think about it. Because that's, I mean, right. And, to come back to your sort of market, the market as God, I mean, advertising is essentially the marriage of words and images tied to a product, but it's words and images together that sell an idea and a notion.
I agree. Yeah. So I think I developed a liking for it during my years as art director for an advertising firm in the Netherlands. Yeah. Before I started studying theology. So I really enjoy doing that. Yeah. Although my real passion is actually music. I'm a musician to the core of my being. And it's only later in life that visual art, starts speaking to me, like Van Gogh or whatever.
Yeah. Although it's interesting how many musicians actually are also do art. To me, there's always there's a similar texture to music. I mean, they're very distinct fields, obviously, and some people don't bother. They're only about music, but I do think there's a correlation between sonic arts and visual arts, and They're modes. I mean, they're modes of expression, and they're symbolic expression. You know, whether it's a song, or whether it's a piece of art, or whether it's just a meme. It carries a certain emotional palette that you can enter into. If it appeals to you, you know, it's like you bounce off it. If you don't, it's like, you know, you hear a song and everybody's raving.
They're connected. And so when I went into advertising, I realized very soon that I was translating my musical abilities into the gift for graphic design. And then after that, for putting graphic design and words together. And you're right, it's always the symbolic, the metaphorical reality. Now, when I went to study theology, I thought I was moving away from that to the realm of logic, right? Foundationalism and all that shit. Until I realized, no, theology is deeply creative. It is one of the creative arts.
Yeah, it's funny how that, you know, they at one point they called theology the queen of the sciences. But it was also then for a long time under the liberal arts. And I think that you have a little bit of a tension there, because for some people, theology it's science, you know, the sort of factual, literal kind of apologist path that you were going to take, you know. Whereas the artistic, you know, gives you, because the art is always, it's more symbolic and semiotic. And that's what I like about your pieces. There's a semiotic dynamic to them as a sign. And I think that's why they read well, because they're little signposts, you know, and they give you just enough information to, you know, that if you go 45 kilometers that way, you'll get to where you need to go. But there's no clear path. You just need to know that you need to go that way. I think that's how semiotics works best.
And speaking of your pieces, Josh, where can people find you if they want to engage with your work?
So they can find me on Instagram, After God's End. And I also have a website, aftergodsend.com. And that's where I post longer pieces in the best English I'm able to produce. And so it's not super, but it's not bad either.
I'm sure.
As a copywriter, I do write English for my clients as well. And so my clients in the Netherlands are quite happy with it. It's maybe not 100%, but it's maybe 98%. I don't know.
Well, it's better than most people's Dutch, so that's a good start.
That's something.
You know, when you learn, I find my friends who speak English as a second language know English better than I do, because they've studied English in a way that I haven't. So usually people who speak English as a second language are way better at it than a native English speaker. So I'm sure it's pretty fabulous. But we will include all of that in the show notes. And Josh, thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a cool conversation for us to have, a very different one from the type we normally have. And we just think you're doing such good work. We have such admiration for what you're doing and your life and your work and everything you're interested and involved in. And hopefully in the next year, we can all meet up in Europe somewhere.
Yeah, let's do some radical theology.
Exactly.
Well, we probably all would have met up already if it wasn't for the pandemic. The last time we saw you was not this November before in Utrecht, right? We were there for the radical theology meeting and the art festival. I can't remember the name of it because it's in Dutch. But it was fabulous. And I have such good memories of like sitting at some very cool bars in Utrecht and talking life and, you know, just doing the European thing. And so we'll do it again. Looking forward to it very much.
Great.
Dankjewel. Tot ziens.
Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks for having me. It was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, we'll do it again soon, and we'll catch everybody on another episode next week. See you all then. Bye.
Bye, everybody.